November 8, 1944, Lorraine, France. Sherman tank commander Lieutenant Robert Earley stared at the smoking wreckage of 3rd Platoon. 4 M4 Shermans destroyed in 11 minutes. The German Panther had fired from 2,200 yards, well beyond the effective range of American 75mm guns. Each American crew had done exactly what training demanded. Advance toward the enemy, maintain frontal armor toward the threat, return fire while closing distance. Each crew burned, the mathematics were absolute. German 88mm guns could penetrate Sherman frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. American 75mm guns required closure to 800 yards for reliable penetration of Panther frontal plate. Simple arithmetic meant American tank crews died trying to close a 1,400-yard gap, while German gunners enjoyed target practice. Staff Sergeant James McBride would later remember the moment that changed everything. We watched Baker Company try the textbook approach: advance, shoot, maneuver. The Panthers knocked them out before they got within 1,000 yards. Then somebody in Charlie Company did something nobody taught us. He backed up his Sherman and lived. The Lorraine campaign was becoming the graveyard of American armor doctrine. Every field manual insisted tanks should face their enemies. Every tactical instructor emphasized the importance of presenting frontal armor to threats. Every crew had been trained that retreat meant death and cowardice in equal measure. But across the muddy fields of eastern France, tank commanders were about to discover that sometimes the fastest way forward was moving in reverse. The briefing room at 3rd Armoured Division headquarters smelled of cigarette smoke and damp wool as Colonel Maurice Rose spread reconnaissance photos across the situation table. November 8, 1944, and the images told a story that every armoured officer in Europe had learned to dread. German Panther and Tiger tanks positioned on ridgelines overlooking the Say River Valley, perfect fields of fire extending beyond 2,000 yards. Terrain that turned American armor doctrine into a death sentence written in burning steel. Rose's staff officers stood in careful formation as he traced German defensive positions with a grease pencil. The Panther tanks occupied hull-down positions that exposed only their turrets and main guns. Their long 75mm weapons could engage American Shermans at ranges where return fire was mathematically impossible. "Gentlemen," Rose announced with the controlled frustration of a commander watching doctrine fail his men, "we've lost 42 Shermans in 3 days attempting to cross this valley. German gunnery reports indicate average engagement range of 1,900 yards. Our effective counterfire range against Panther frontal armor is approximately 750 yards. The calculation was brutally simple. Every Sherman attempting to close that 1,100-yard gap ran a gauntlet where German guns could fire 6 to 8 rounds before American weapons came into effective range. Panther gunners needed only 1 shot. Sherman crews needed luck that mathematics said didn't exist. Captain Robert Earley of Baker Company stepped forward with after-action reports that documented the tactical nightmare. His company had lost 7 tanks that morning, executing standard assault doctrine. Advance in formation. Maintain frontal armor toward the enemy. Use smoke and maneuver to close engagement range. The Panthers had destroyed his lead platoon before the smoke rounds even landed. "Sir, frontal assault doctrine assumes we can survive the approach," Earley reported, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had watched friends die following procedures that worked perfectly in training. "Against Panthers in prepared positions, we're asking crews to cross-kill. Zones where enemy fire is effective and ours isn't. The math doesn't work." Rose nodded grimly. 3rd Armoured had been bleeding crews and equipment since entering Lorraine 3 weeks earlier. The German defensive positions exploited terrain that made American armor mobility irrelevant. Long sight lines meant German guns engaged at maximum advantage. Rolling hills provided hull-down positions that exposed minimal target area while maximizing fields of fire. 800 miles away, Hauptmann Klaus Becker studied engagement reports that told a different story entirely. His Panther Company of the 2nd Panzer Division had destroyed 63 American tanks in 2 weeks without suffering a single mobility kill. The American tactics were predictable to the point of absurdity. Sherman formations advanced across open ground in textbook formations. Spacing was regulation. Approach angles were doctrinally correct. Speed and maneuver matched exactly what German tactical instructors had taught officers to expect from American armor. "The Americans fight like they're still training at Fort Knox," Becker commented to his gunner, Obergefreiter Hans Weber. "Same formations, same approaches, same mistakes. They advance until we destroy them. Then the next formation advances and dies the same way." Weber had been a competitive target shooter before the war and understood the ballistic mathematics that made Lorraine a killing ground for American armor. The Panthers' 75mm KWK-42 gun could penetrate 140mm of armor at 2,000 meters. Sherman frontal armor measured 76mm at its thickest point. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The engagement ranges meant German gunners could fire for effect, while American crews were still trying to identify targets through their optical sights. By the time a Sherman crew acquired the Panther, aimed their gun, and fired, the German crew had already put 2 or 3 rounds into American steel. The ballistic advantage was so overwhelming that Becker's company had begun treating Sherman engagements as advanced gunnery training rather than combat operations. 300 yards behind the American front lines, Staff Sergeant James McBride sat in his command cupola, watching smoke rise from Baker Company's latest disaster. The Mississippi-born tanker had survived Sicily, Anzio, and Normandy by developing instincts that training manuals never captured. The kind of battlefield awareness that kept experienced crews alive when doctrine killed everyone else. McBride had watched 4 different companies attempt the textbook approach to crossing the Seine River Valley. Each attack followed identical patterns: artillery preparation, smoke screen deployment, armor advance in staggered formation. German Panthers waited until American tanks reached optimal engagement range, then systematically destroyed lead elements before the formation could close to effective counterfire distance. The pattern was so consistent that McBride had begun calculating survival odds like a gambler studying a rigged poker game. Lead tanks died first, victim of concentrated German fire on the most obvious targets. Second-wave units fared slightly better but still suffered catastrophic losses trying to close impossible ranges under accurate enemy fire. The crews that survived longest were the ones that violated doctrine, the commanders who used terrain aggressively, who fired smoke to cover lateral movement rather than frontal advance, who understood that sometimes movement away from the enemy was more tactically sound than blind courage. The innovation came not from tactical genius, but from mechanical accident. During the morning attack on November 9th, Sherman tank commander Sergeant William Porter's transmission developed a problem in the forward gears. His tank could move in reverse at normal speed but could only crawl forward at walking pace. Porter's crew found themselves under fire from a Panther positioned on a distant ridgeline. Doctrine demanded they advance to close engagement range. Mechanical reality made that option impossible. Porter made a decision born of desperation rather than tactical brilliance. He reversed his Sherman at maximum speed, keeping his frontal armor toward the Panther while opening the range instead of closing it. The geometry of the engagement changed instantly. The Panther's gunner fired 3 rounds at the retreating Sherman, each shot missing by increasingly wider margins as range opened and the moving target became more difficult to engage effectively. Porter's crew escaped destruction not through superior armor or firepower, but through violating every tactical principle taught at Fort Knox. McBride watched the engagement through his binoculars with growing fascination. Porter's Sherman was moving away from the fight at 15 miles per hour in reverse, keeping frontal armor toward the threat, while increasing distance to the point where German gunnery accuracy degraded significantly. The concept violated every instinct trained into American tank commanders, but the results were undeniable. The Sherman that retreated survived. The tanks that advanced according to doctrine continued burning. That evening, McBride gathered his platoon leaders for an informal tactical discussion that would never appear in any after-action report. The conversation violated military protocol in ways that could trigger court-martial proceedings if overheard by the wrong officers. Suggesting that standard doctrine was fundamentally flawed, bordered on insubordination. Recommending tactics that involved retreating under fire contradicted everything the army taught about courage and aggressive action. "Listen carefully," McBride began, keeping his voice low enough that only his most trusted NCOs could hear. "We're dying because we're doing exactly what the Germans expect. They've got longer-range guns, better optics, and prepared positions. Every time we advance across open ground, we're giving them exactly the target profile they've trained to destroy." Staff Sergeant Mitchell from 2nd Platoon nodded slowly. He'd lost half his crews in the past week, following textbook assault procedures. "The doctrine assumes we're fighting other Shermans, Sergeant. Against Panthers, we're outranged and outgunned before we even start moving." The tactical mathematics were brutal, but undeniable. German Panthers could engage effectively at ranges where American return fire was essentially harassment rather than destruction. The only way to survive was either to close the range impossibly fast or to refuse engagement until circumstances favored American capabilities. Closing range at 15 miles per hour across open ground under accurate enemy fire was proving lethal. But opening range, while maintaining defensive posture, created survival possibilities that doctrine said shouldn't exist. Porter's transmission problem gave us something the field manuals don't teach, McBride continued. His tank survived because he was moving away from the threat fast enough that German gunnery couldn't compensate for range change and target movement. The Panther gunner was aiming at where Porter's Sherman had been, not where it was going. The concept was counterintuitive enough that several platoon leaders exchanged skeptical glances. American tank doctrine, since the mechanization of cavalry, had emphasized aggressive action and forward movement. Retreat was associated with defeat, cowardice, and tactical failure. Suggesting that moving backward might improve survival contradicted fundamental assumptions about armored warfare. But the burning Shermans scattered across Lorraine told their own story. 42 tanks destroyed in 3 days following approved doctrine. 1 tank survived by doing exactly what training said was wrong. "Tomorrow morning's attack will follow the same pattern," McBride stated flatly. "Battalion will order frontal assault across the same valley where we've been losing tanks all week. German Panthers will be waiting in the same hull-down positions with the same ballistic advantage they've enjoyed since we got here." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. What he was about to suggest could be interpreted as refusing orders or advocating cowardice in the face of the enemy. But watching more crews die for doctrine that didn't work was something McBride could no longer accept. "We're going to try something different. When we make contact with German armor at long range, we're not going to advance until we die. We're going to back up fast, keep our frontal armor toward the threat, and open the range until we can either break contact or find cover that gives us tactical advantage." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Every man present understood they were discussing tactics that violated standing orders and fundamental principles of American armor doctrine. If the approach failed, they would face courts-martial for cowardice. If it succeeded, they would face questions about why they had refused to follow standard assault procedures. "Sergeant, that's retreating under fire," Lieutenant Harrison from 3rd Platoon pointed out, his voice carefully neutral. "Battalion doctrine specifically prohibits withdrawal without authorization during offensive operations." McBride met Harrison's eyes with the flat stare of a man who had watched too many friends burn. "Battalion doctrine assumes we've got equipment that can win the fight. Against Panthers at 2,000 yards, we don't. We're asking crews to die, proving mathematics that stopped working the first time we faced German long-range guns." The moral calculation was clear enough that no one needed it spelled out explicitly. Following orders meant dying according to approved procedures. Violating doctrine meant possibly surviving through tactics that training insisted were cowardice. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez spoke up from the back of the group. "My crew will try it. We've lost 3 tanks this week doing everything by the book. If backing up keeps us alive long enough to find better engagement positions, I'll risk a court-martial over a funeral." Others nodded slowly, the kind of careful agreement that avoided explicit commitment but acknowledged shared understanding. American tank crews were caught between doctrine that killed them and tactical innovation that might be punished as cowardice. The mathematics of survival were pushing experienced commanders toward conclusions that formal training said were impossible. The next morning's attack began at 0600 hours, with artillery preparation and smoke deployment that followed textbook procedures exactly. 3rd Armored Division's assault plan called for 3 company-strength formations to advance across the Say River Valley, close with German defensive positions, and destroy enemy armor through superior American aggression and numerical advantage. Colonel Rose watched from his command post as the attack developed according to plan. First-wave units crossed the line of departure on schedule, maintaining proper spacing and formation discipline. Smoke obscured some German observation points while allowing American forward observers to maintain visual contact with advancing units. Everything was proceeding exactly as doctrine demanded, which meant crews were about to start dying. McBride's platoon was assigned to the 2nd wave, scheduled to exploit whatever breakthrough the 1st wave achieved. He watched through his commander's periscope as Baker Company's lead tanks advanced across open ground toward the tree line, where reconnaissance had identified German positions. The Panthers opened fire at 1,800 yards, well beyond the range where Sherman's 75mm guns could penetrate German frontal armor. The first American tank died before its crew realized they were under effective enemy fire. The 2nd and 3rd tanks survived perhaps 20 seconds longer before German gunners adjusted for range and wind. Baker Company attempted to execute standard counterfire maneuvers. Tanks spread out to present multiple targets while continuing to advance toward engagement ranges where American guns might be effective. Smoke rounds were fired to obscure German observation. Individual commanders maneuvered aggressively to throw off enemy gunnery solutions. All the correct procedures, executed professionally by experienced crews who had trained for years to fight this way. 8 tanks destroyed in 7 minutes. All Charlie Company elements, this is Charlie 6, McBride transmitted over the company net. Execute reverse defensive maneuver on contact. Maintain frontal aspect to threats. Maximum reverse. Speed. Acknowledge. The responses came back quickly from commanders who had spent the previous evening discussing exactly this scenario. They understood what McBride was ordering, even though no field manual contained procedures for what he was describing. Charlie Company crossed the line of departure at 0630 hours, 20 minutes behind Baker Company's destroyed lead elements. German Panthers identified the new targets immediately and opened fire at ranges exceeding 1,900 yards. The first rounds impacted near Charlie Company's lead tanks, bracketing shots that German gunners would use to refine range estimates. Instead of advancing into the kill zone, McBride's platoon executed the maneuver that doctrine said was impossible. 5 Sherman tanks shifted into reverse simultaneously, backing up at 15 miles per hour while keeping their frontal armor toward the German positions. Turrets remained oriented toward the threat. Main guns continued firing, though at ranges where penetration was unlikely. The effect on German gunnery was immediate and dramatic. Panther gunners had calculated firing solutions based on standard American approach patterns, targets that advanced at predictable speeds across known terrain. The sudden reversal of movement direction forced gunners to recalculate range, lead angle, and target velocity on the fly. The second volley of German fire missed entirely. Rounds impacted where American tanks should have been if they had continued advancing according to doctrine. By the time Panther gunners adjusted their aim, the Shermans had opened range another 200 yards and were maneuvering laterally while continuing to reverse. McBride's tank backed over a low rise that provided hull-down protection while maintaining frontal armor toward the enemy. His crew continued firing high-explosive rounds toward German positions, not expecting penetrations but forcing Panther crews to remain buttoned up and limiting their observation capability. Charlie 3-2, this is Charlie 6. McBride transmitted to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. Continue reverse movement to that tree line at our 6 o'clock. Use smoke to cover lateral displacement once you've got terrain masking. His Sherman continued backing up at maximum reverse speed, crew maintaining fire discipline while their commander navigated using the periscope view of terrain behind them. The maneuver required driving skills that most tank training never addressed. Navigating in reverse at combat speed across broken ground while under fire and maintaining situational awareness of threats ahead. German fire continued, but with decreasing accuracy as American tanks opened engagement ranges and used terrain to break line of sight. The Panther gunners were discovering that moving targets heading away from them were significantly more difficult to engage than advancing targets, following predictable approach routes. By 0700 hours, Charlie Company had broken contact with German armor without suffering a single loss. The tactical impossibility that doctrine said couldn't work had just saved 20 American tank crews from the fate that had destroyed 8 Baker Company Shermans in the same engagement area. Colonel Rose received the after-action reports with the careful expression of a senior officer trying to decide if tactical innovation was brilliant or insubordinate. Charlie Company had refused to advance during an offensive operation. They had retreated under fire, violating explicit doctrine about maintaining aggressive action against the enemy. They had also survived while executing the same mission that had destroyed Baker Company. Captain McBride, Rose began, using the field promotion that had been processed that morning. Your company report indicates you executed a reverse movement under enemy fire. Battalion doctrine specifically prohibits withdrawal during offensive operations without authorization. McBride stood at attention with the careful neutrality of an NCO who knew he was either about to be decorated or court-martialed. Yes, sir. My assessment was that advancing into effective enemy fire at ranges where our weapons couldn't engage successfully would result in company destruction similar to Baker Company's losses. I chose to break contact and reposition for engagement at ranges favoring our capabilities. The military euphemisms couldn't quite hide what had actually happened. McBride's company had backed up fast enough that German guns couldn't track them effectively, then used terrain to escape the kill zone entirely. The maneuver had preserved 20 tanks and 100 crew members at the cost of violating doctrine that Rose himself had written. Your tactical assessment was that maintaining frontal armor toward the enemy while opening range would improve survival over standard assault procedures? Rose asked, his voice giving away nothing about what he was thinking. Yes, sir. German Panthers can destroy Shermans at ranges where we can't effectively return fire. Closing that range under direct fire results in catastrophic losses before we reach effective engagement distance. Opening the range denies them their advantage while maintaining our defensive posture. The logic was flawless, even if the tactics were heretical. Rose had spent 20 years in the army, learning that armor should advance, attack, and maintain aggressive action against enemy forces. The idea that moving backwards might be tactically superior violated everything he had been taught about mounted warfare. But the burning Shermans in the Saale River Valley told their own story. Doctrine was killing American tank crews faster than German guns. Rose made his decision with the pragmatism of a combat commander who valued results over regulations. Your tactical innovation will be evaluated for implementation across the division. Prepare a training demonstration for company commanders. We need procedures that keep crews alive, even if they violate what Fort Knox taught us. The word spread through 3rd Armored Division with the speed that only survival information achieved in combat units. Tank commanders gathered in informal groups to discuss the impossible tactic that Charlie Company had used to survive what had killed Baker Company. The conversations happened in maintenance areas and command posts, anywhere experienced NCOs could talk without officers overhearing discussions that bordered on mutiny. Staff Sergeant Porter, whose mechanical breakdown had accidentally discovered the technique, found himself explaining the geometry of reverse movement to commanders who had spent years learning that tanks should always advance toward threats. The concept was simple enough that any driver could execute it, but psychologically challenging enough that many commanders struggled to accept it. "You're driving blind," Lieutenant Chen from Able Company pointed out. "Moving in reverse at 15 miles per hour means you can't see where you're going. One ditch, one shell crater, one piece of wreckage, and you've immobilized your tank in the middle of a fight." Porter nodded. "Yes, sir. But advancing at 15 miles per hour into accurate enemy fire at 2,000 yards means you're dead before you reach effective range. I'll take the risk of hitting a ditch over the certainty of eating an 88mm round through my frontal plate." The risk calculation was brutal, but mathematically sound. Reversing across broken ground carried perhaps a 30% chance of mobility kill from terrain hazards. Advancing into prepared German positions at long range carried an 80% casualty rate based on recent engagement statistics. American tank crews were learning to calculate survival odds like gamblers studying house advantages. The training demonstrations began on November 11th with McBride's most experienced crews, showing the techniques they had developed through trial and error. The maneuvers looked absurd to observers trained in conventional armor doctrine, Sherman tanks backing up at maximum speed while crews maintained fire toward distant targets they were actively fleeing from, but the results were undeniable. Tanks executing reverse defensive maneuvers survived German long-range fire that destroyed conventionally maneuvering units. The technique wasn't elegant or doctrinally sound, but it kept crews alive in situations where approved tactics guaranteed death. The psychological barrier proved harder to overcome than the mechanical challenges. American tank commanders had been trained since basic that courage meant advancing toward the enemy and cowardice meant retreat. The military culture reinforced aggressive action through every level of training and indoctrination, suggesting that moving away from threats might be tactically superior challenged fundamental assumptions about what it meant to be a soldier. Lieutenant Harrison from 3rd Platoon articulated the concern that many commanders felt but few were willing to voice openly. "Sergeant, this tactic is essentially running away from a fight. How do we maintain unit cohesion and combat effectiveness if we're teaching crews that backing up is an acceptable response to enemy contact?" McBride's response came from the hard-earned wisdom of a man who had watched too many friends die for abstract principles. "Sir, there's a difference between retreating from a fight and refusing to die for mathematics that don't work. When German Panthers open fire at 2,000 yards, advancing isn't courage, it's suicide. We back up until we can find engagement conditions that favor our capabilities, then we fight on our terms instead of theirs." The distinction was subtle but critical. The reverse defensive maneuver wasn't about avoiding combat, it was about refusing to accept engagement under conditions that guaranteed American defeat. The tactic acknowledged ballistic realities that doctrine had failed to address. German long-range gunnery advantages meant direct frontal approaches across open ground were tactically obsolete, regardless of what field manuals insisted. By mid-November, approximately 40% of 3rd Armored Division's tank commanders had adopted some version of the reverse defensive maneuver. The implementation was inconsistent and unofficial, spread through word of mouth between crews rather than formal training channels. Officers who understood the tactical necessity tolerated the practice while carefully avoiding any official documentation that might trigger questions from higher headquarters. The German response revealed how profoundly the tactic disrupted established engagement patterns. Hauptmann Becker's after-action reports showed increasing frustration with American armor that refused to behave according to predictable doctrine. Sherman formations that had previously advanced into kill zones were now backing up at speeds that made accurate long-range gunnery nearly impossible. The Americans have changed their tactics. Becker reported to his battalion commander on November 16th. They no longer advance directly toward our positions. When we open fire, they reverse at maximum speed while maintaining frontal aspect. Our gunners are trained to engage advancing targets, not retreating ones at increasing ranges. The observation highlighted a critical weakness in German anti-tank doctrine. Panther crews had practiced engaging American armor that behaved predictably, following standard approach patterns at known speeds. The sudden introduction of reverse movement at combat speeds forced gunners to recalculate firing solutions for target behavior that their training had never addressed. Weber, Becker's gunner, explained the technical challenge during a maintenance halt. Herr Hauptmann, when American tanks advance, I can calculate range reduction and adjust my point of aim accordingly. When they reverse, I must account for range increase, while the target is also maneuvering laterally. The ballistic solution becomes significantly more complex, especially at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. The mathematics that had favored German long-range gunnery began working against them when American tanks refused to close range predictably. Each second of reverse movement opened the engagement distance by approximately 7 meters. German gunners needed 3 to 5 seconds to aim, fire, and observe results. In that time, American tanks had increased range by 20 to 30 meters, requiring immediate recalculation of firing solutions. The cumulative effect was degradation of German first-hit probability from approximately 75% against advancing targets to less than 40% against reversing targets. American tank crews were discovering that the fastest way to survive, long-range engagement, was moving in the opposite direction that doctrine demanded. The tactical evolution continued through practical experience rather than formal training. Tank commanders developed techniques for reverse navigation that allowed high-speed movement across broken terrain while maintaining situational awareness of threats ahead. Drivers learned to use periscope mirrors and commander guidance to avoid obstacles while backing up at speeds that felt suicidal. The most innovative solution came from Staff Sergeant Mitchell's crew, who developed a 2-man navigation system for sustained reverse movement. The driver operated the tank in reverse using verbal guidance from the loader, who monitored terrain behind the vehicle through the sponson periscope. This freed the tank commander to focus entirely on threat assessment and gunnery direction. Driver back steady, loader calls obstacles, Mitchell explained during an informal training session. Commander maintains situational awareness forward and directs fire. Gunner engages targets regardless of movement direction. We've backed up over 2 miles of French countryside using this system without hitting anything critical. The technique spread rapidly through units that had adopted reverse defensive maneuvers. Crews discovered they could maintain combat effectiveness while moving in reverse at speeds approaching their forward capability. The psychological barrier of running away diminished as commanders recognized they were executing tactical repositioning under fire rather than retreating from combat. By late November, engagement statistics showed remarkable divergence between units employing reverse defensive tactics and those following conventional doctrine. Companies using reverse maneuvers suffered average casualty rates of 12% during long-range engagements with German armor. Units following standard assault procedures experienced casualty rates exceeding 60% in identical, tactical situations. The numbers were impossible to ignore, even for officers committed to conventional doctrine. 3rd Armoured Division's tank loss rates had dropped 40% since McBride's innovation began spreading through the ranks. More importantly, crew survival rates had increased dramatically, as tanks that might have been destroyed now escaped through maneuvers that kept them in the fight longer. Colonel Rose formalized the tactical innovation on November 28th with a division-wide training directive that carefully avoided calling the maneuver what it obviously was. The official terminology was reverse tactical repositioning under long-range fire, a euphemism designed to make retreat sound like approved military doctrine. The training memorandum specified exact procedures for executing reverse movement while maintaining combat effectiveness. Crews were directed to maintain frontal armor aspect toward threats, continue returning fire during movement, and use terrain. features to break line of sight before reversing direction for counterattack. The document represented a remarkable evolution in American armor doctrine, acknowledging that sometimes the most tactically sound response to enemy contact was moving away from the threat at maximum speed. The innovation had come not from staff college analysis or formal tactical studies, but from desperate tank commanders trying to survive ballistic mathematics that doctrine refused to acknowledge. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategic implications became clear during the first week of December, when 3rd Armored Division executed a series of engagements that would have been impossible using conventional tactics. German defensive positions in the Lorraine region had been selected specifically to exploit long-range gunnery advantages. Ridge lines and open approaches that channeled American armor into kill zones where Panthers could engage at maximum ballistic advantage. The reverse defensive maneuver turned those prepared positions into tactical liabilities. American tanks that contacted German armor at long range no longer advanced into perfectly sighted kill zones. Instead, they backed up rapidly, forcing German crews to either abandon prepared positions for pursuit or watch American armor escape engagement entirely. The December 4th battle for the town of Sarre Union demonstrated how profoundly the tactical balance had shifted. German Panther companies occupied carefully prepared positions overlooking 3 miles of open approaches. The defensive plan assumed American armor would advance across those approaches according to doctrine, allowing German gunners to destroy attackers at ranges exceeding 1,800 yards. McBride's company made initial contact with German positions at 0700 hours. Panther fire from the ridgeline destroyed the lead tank in the advance formation before the crew could identify the threat source. Standard doctrine would have required the company to continue advancing, using smoke and maneuver to close engagement range, while accepting casualties necessary to accomplish the mission. Instead, McBride ordered immediate reverse tactical repositioning. 23 Sherman tanks shifted into reverse simultaneously, backing up at maximum speed while maintaining frontal armor toward the German positions. Turrets remained oriented toward the ridgeline. Gunners continued firing high-explosive rounds to suppress enemy observation. The German response revealed how completely the tactical situation had changed. Panther crews attempted to engage the reversing American armor, but found their carefully calculated firing positions had become useless. The ranges that had been perfect for engaging advancing targets were too great for accurate fire against rapidly reversing targets maneuvering across broken ground. Becker watched in frustration as his company's prepared defensive position failed to stop an American attack that never actually advanced. "They're backing up faster than we can adjust our fire. Every time my gunner acquires a target, the range has changed enough to require recalculation. We're firing at where they were, not where they are." The tactical stalemate lasted 20 minutes before McBride identified a covered approach route that allowed his company to advance toward German positions from a direction the defensive plan had never anticipated. While Panther crews remained focused on the open kill zone where American tanks were supposed to appear, Sherman formations used terrain masking to close range from an unexpected angle. By 0830 hours, Charlie Company had reached effective engagement range against German armor that had been positioned to fight a completely different battle. The Panthers attempted to reposition but found themselves trapped by the same terrain features they had selected for defensive advantage. The engagement that should have been a German turkey shoot became a close-range armor battle, where American numerical superiority proved decisive. Sarre Union fell by mid-afternoon with 3rd Armored Division, suffering fewer than 20 tank losses in an operation that pre-November doctrine would have cost over 100 vehicles. The reverse defensive maneuver had transformed American tactical capabilities by refusing to fight battles on German terms. The innovation spread beyond 3rd Armored Division through informal networks that connected tank crews across the European theatre. Maintenance personnel rotated between units carried stories about the crazy tactic where Sherman crews drove backwards to survive Panther fire. Replacement crews arriving from stateside training heard about the technique from combat veterans who explained that Fort Knox doctrine would get them killed in the first engagement. By January 1945, variants of the reverse defensive maneuver had been adopted by armoured units throughout 1st and 3rd Armies. The implementation remained inconsistent and largely unofficial, tolerated by commanders who valued results over doctrinal purity. Training manuals still taught conventional assault tactics, but experienced crews understood that survival required adapting to battlefield realities that manuals refused to acknowledge. The German High Command struggled to develop effective countermeasures. Staff studies analyzed American tactical changes and recommended modifications to defensive doctrine, but the fundamental problem remained insoluble. German armor advantages depended on long-range gunnery that became ineffective when American tanks refused to close range predictably. Attempting to pursue reversing American armor meant abandoning prepared positions and accepting engagements at ranges where Sherman numerical superiority negated German technical advantages. Maintaining defensive positions meant watching American formations escape engagement and find alternative approach routes. Either option surrendered the tactical initiative that had made German armor so effective during the summer fighting. The human cost of the tactical revolution was measured in lives saved rather than lives lost. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez calculated that his crew had survived 7 engagements during December that would have been fatal using conventional tactics. Each time German armor opened fire at long range, Rodriguez's Sherman had backed up until terrain or smoke broke line of sight, then maneuvered for better engagement positions. "We're alive because somebody figured out that sometimes you win by not losing," Rodriguez explained to a replacement crew arriving in January 1945. "The Panthers want to kill us at 2,000 yards where their guns work and ours don't. We back up, make them miss, and find ways to fight at 800 yards where we've got the advantage." The mathematical elegance of the tactic was its simplicity. Instead of trying to overcome German ballistic advantages through better armor or bigger guns, American tank crews had simply refused to accept engagement under conditions that favored enemy capabilities. The reverse defensive maneuver acknowledged that sometimes tactical wisdom meant moving away from threats until circumstances changed. Lieutenant Earley, who had survived the destruction of Baker Company in November, found himself training new tank commanders in techniques that would have earned him a court-martial 6 months earlier. The formal instruction emphasized maintaining aggressive action and closing with the enemy, but informal guidance explained how to stay alive long enough to accomplish the mission. The manual says advance toward threats and maintain frontal armor facing the enemy, Earley told a group of replacement officers fresh from Fort Knox. What the manual doesn't say is that advancing at 15 miles per hour into Panther fire at 2,000 yards is suicide. You back up fast, you stay alive, and you find ways to kill Germans on your terms instead of theirs. The dichotomy between official doctrine and practical reality created cognitive dissonance for new crews trying to reconcile what they had been taught with what combat veterans insisted was necessary for survival. Training emphasized courage, aggression, and forward movement. Experience taught that survival required tactical flexibility, including willingness to move backwards when mathematics demanded it. The breaking point for official doctrine came in late January, when General Patton himself witnessed a reverse defensive maneuver during a frontline visit. Third Army's commander watched through binoculars as American armor contacted German positions, immediately reversed at high speed, and used the maneuver to escape a prepared kill zone before maneuvering for more favorable engagement. Patton's initial reaction was predictable fury at what appeared to be American tanks retreating under fire. His aide had to explain 3 times that the maneuver was tactical repositioning rather than cowardice, before Patton grudgingly acknowledged that the technique had merit. "I don't like it," Patton admitted to Colonel Rose during a command briefing that evening. "Everything in my bones says tanks should attack, not back up. But I can't argue with casualty statistics that show this crazy tactic keeps crews alive and accomplishes the mission." The endorsement, however reluctant, provided top cover for commanders who had been tolerating tactical innovations that violated official doctrine. If Patton himself acknowledged that reverse movement had legitimate tactical applications, then company and battalion commanders could stop pretending they didn't know their crews were backing up under fire. The formal doctrinal change came in February 1945, with the publication of updated 45-part Morale, Tactical Guidelines for Armoured Operations Against Prepared Defensive Positions. The language remained carefully neutral, emphasizing tactical flexibility and engagement range management, rather than explicitly endorsing retreat under fire. But the operational meaning was clear. American tank commanders were authorized to use reverse movement as a tactical option when long-range enemy fire made conventional assault approaches impractical. The innovation that had begun with Staff Sergeant Porter's mechanical breakdown and spread through informal networks had become official American armor doctrine. The February 15th attack on the Siegfried Line fortifications demonstrated how thoroughly the tactical evolution had transformed American armored capabilities. German defensive positions incorporated massive concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and carefully prepared firing positions that made conventional assault approaches suicidal. 3rd Armored Division approached the fortifications, using techniques that would have been impossible before November. Lead elements made contact with German positions, immediately executed reverse tactical repositioning to escape prepared kill zones, then used the breathing space to identify weaknesses in defensive layout that frontal assault would never have revealed. The engagement pattern repeated across dozens of separate actions. American armor refused to die attacking German strong points at disadvantageous ranges. Instead, Sherman crews backed up, maneuvered, probed, and eventually found approach routes that allowed engagement on American terms rather than German defensive plans. Becker's Panther Company found itself defending positions that had been designed to stop attacks that no longer came. American tanks that should have advanced into prepared kill zones instead backed away, forcing German crews to either abandon fortifications for pursuit or watch attackers escape and reappear from unexpected directions. "We're losing. Tactical initiative to an enemy that refuses to fight the battle we prepared for." Becker reported with frustration that bordered on despair. Every defensive position assumes American armor will advance according to doctrine. When they back up instead, our preparations become worthless. The Siegfried Line fell in early March with American casualty rates running 40% below staff estimates. The defensive fortifications that had been constructed to exploit American tactical predictability failed when Sherman crews refused to behave predictably. Tank commanders who had learned to survive by backing up had discovered they could also win by refusing to accept engagement on enemy terms. McBride received his battlefield commission to second lieutenant on March 10, 1945. With citations specifically mentioning his development of tactical innovations that had saved hundreds of American lives. The promotion ceremony took place in a liberated German town where 6 months earlier his reverse defensive maneuver would have been considered cowardice. The human mathematics of the innovation were stark and undeniable. 3rd Armored Division's tank casualty rates had dropped from 63% during the September-October Lorraine, fighting to 28% during the January-March Rhineland campaign. The difference represented approximately 400 American tank crews who survived combat they would have died in using conventional tactics. Rodriguez calculated his personal survival odds with the dark humor of a man who had beaten impossible statistics. "I should have been dead 7 times since November. Every engagement where we backed up instead of advancing was one where the old tactics would have killed us. Porter's broken transmission saved my life, along with a lot of other people." The tactical legacy extended far beyond individual survival stories. American armored doctrine had evolved from rigid adherence to forward aggression toward flexible engagement management that prioritized mission accomplishment over doctrinal purity. Tank commanders learned to assess ballistic mathematics and make tactical decisions based on engagement conditions rather than abstract principles about courage. The innovation demonstrated that sometimes the most profound military advances came not from superior technology or resources, but from willingness to question fundamental assumptions about how fighting should be conducted. The reverse defensive maneuver succeeded because combat veterans trusted their experience over their training and chose survival over doctrine when the two conflicted. By April 1945, variants of the tactic had spread to British and Canadian armoured units facing similar challenges with German long-range anti-tank capabilities. The technique that had begun as an American improvisation became standard Allied practice for engagement management against superior enemy gunnery. The final validation came during the April 18th engagement near Dessau, where American armour encountered the last major concentration of German Panthers in defensive positions. The battle followed patterns that had become routine since November. German guns opened fire at extreme range. American tanks backed up rapidly to escape kill zones. German crews attempted to adjust fire against reversing targets and failed to achieve hit rates that would stop the American advance. Sherman formations used the tactical breathing space created by reverse movement to identify weak points in German defensive layout, then executed close-range attacks that overwhelmed prepared positions through numerical superiority and tactical surprise. The engagement that should have been an American disaster became a German defeat because doctrine had finally caught up with battlefield reality. McBride survived the war with decorations that carefully avoided mentioning he had taught American tank crews how to run away successfully. His post-war career included assignment to Fort Knox as an instructor, where he discovered the challenge of teaching tactics that contradicted everything the institutional army believed about armored warfare. The training manual revisions took 3 years to complete. The final doctrine acknowledged that reverse tactical movement was a legitimate response to long-range enemy fire, though the language remained carefully euphemistic about what was essentially endorsing retreat as a tactical option. Young officers learned that sometimes moving backwards was the fastest route to victory, though their instructors still struggled to explain why. The statistical analysis completed by Army Ordnance in 1948 confirmed what combat veterans had known since November 1944. American tank casualty rates during engagements where reverse defensive maneuvers were employed averaged 32% lower than engagements following conventional assault doctrine. The survival advantage was consistent across different terrain, enemy force compositions, and tactical situations. The human cost of doctrinal rigidity could be measured in the 847 Sherman tanks destroyed during the pre-November fighting in Lorraine. Each of those vehicles represented a crew that had died doing exactly what training demanded, advancing toward enemies who killed them before they could return effective fire. The innovation that saved hundreds of subsequent crews came too late for the men who burned following doctrine that mathematics said couldn't work. Rodriguez returned to his Mississippi farm after discharge, applying the same tactical flexibility to civilian life that had kept him alive through 2 years of armored combat. When neighbors asked about his war service, he would mention the crazy innovation where tank crews drove backwards to survive, then deflect further questions with humor that masked the calculations he still ran in his head about how many times he should have died. Porter's mechanical breakdown had sparked an innovation that transformed American armored tactics and saved hundreds of lives by forcing crews to question whether advancing toward threats was always the correct tactical response. The transmission problem that prevented forward movement had accidentally revealed that sometimes moving backwards at maximum speed was the best way to stay alive long enough to win. The final irony came years later, when German military analysts studied American tactical innovations and concluded that the reverse defensive maneuver represented one of the most significant doctrinal advances of the war. The technique that American commanders had initially considered cowardice had proven more tactically sophisticated than German defensive planning that assumed enemy behavior would remain predictable. The mathematics of survival that Staff Sergeant McBride had calculated on that November morning in Lorraine became the foundation for armored doctrine that would influence tank warfare for generations. The principle was deceptively simple. Refusing to fight on enemy terms was not cowardice but tactical intelligence. American tank crews had learned this lesson through blood and burning steel. paying tuition measured in destroyed Shermans until someone finally questioned whether doctrine written at Fort Knox applied to battlefields where German guns outranged American weapons by 1,400 yards. The post-war analysis revealed numbers that training manuals had never acknowledged. During the September through October 1944 Lorraine campaign, American armored units, following conventional assault doctrine, suffered average casualty rates of 63% when engaging German Panthers in prepared defensive positions. During the November through April period, when reverse defensive maneuvers became widespread, casualty rates for identical tactical situations dropped to 28%. The difference represented more than statistical variation. It was the measure of how many American tank crews went home alive, instead of burning in French and German fields, because someone had the courage to drive backwards. Lieutenant Earley would spend the rest of his military career explaining to skeptical armor officers why retreat under fire sometimes represented the most tactically sound decision a tank commander could make. The institutional resistance never fully disappeared. The army that had built its reputation on aggressive action and forward movement struggled to formally acknowledge that sometimes moving in reverse at 15 miles per hour was the fastest path to victory. But the crews who had survived Lorraine and the Rhineland knew better. They had watched friends die following approved tactics that ignored ballistic mathematics. They had learned that courage without tactical intelligence was just another word for acceptable losses in staff officer reports. The reverse defensive maneuver represented something the army rarely admitted, that sometimes the enlisted men who actually fought the battles understood tactical reality better than the officers who planned them. The technique's unofficial nature throughout most of the war revealed the gap between institutional doctrine and battlefield innovation. Tank commanders executed reverse maneuvers while carefully avoiding any official documentation that might trigger questions from higher headquarters. Company-level officers tolerated practices they could not formally endorse. Battalion commanders looked the other way while their units survived using tactics that field manuals insisted were impossible. The conspiracy of silence protected both the innovation and the careers of officers who valued results over regulations. It also demonstrated that effective military organizations sometimes succeeded despite their doctrine rather than because of it. Staff Sergeant Porter returned to civilian life with a modest disability, pension for injuries unrelated to the transmission breakdown that had changed armored warfare. He never sought recognition for the accidental discovery that saved hundreds of lives, preferring the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his mechanical problem had revealed a tactical solution. When fellow veterans gathered to share war stories, Porter would mention in passing that sometimes the best innovations came from equipment failures that forced you to think differently about problems. The German perspective on American tactical evolution appeared in captured documents analyzed years after the war ended. Hauptmann Becker's final combat reports from March 1945 expressed profound frustration with an enemy that refused to behave according to established patterns. His Panther company had been positioned, trained, and equipped to destroy American armor using long-range gunnery advantages that became worthless when Sherman crews backed up instead of advancing. "We prepared for an enemy that would fight according to their doctrine," Becker wrote. "When they changed their tactics to nullify our advantages, we had no effective response. The Americans won not through superior equipment or training, but through willingness to abandon failed approaches in favor of methods that worked." The acknowledgement from an experienced German tank commander validated what American crews had known since November. Tactical flexibility and willingness to question doctrine had proven more valuable than armor thickness or gun caliber. The reverse defensive maneuver succeeded because it addressed battlefield reality that formal training had refused to acknowledge. Rodriguez died in 1987, having never fully explained to his family why he always backed his pickup truck into parking spaces. The habit was a remnant of muscle memory developed during months of reversing Sherman tanks away from German fire. His children knew their father had served in armored units during the war, but the details remained locked behind the careful silence that many combat veterans maintained about experiences that civilian life could never quite understand. The tactical legacy lived on in armored doctrine that finally, grudgingly, acknowledged that advance toward the enemy was a guideline rather than an absolute requirement. Modern tank commanders learned about engagement range management and tactical repositioning, euphemisms that meant sometimes you backed up fast to avoid dying stupidly. The innovation that had begun with Porter's transmission failure and spread through informal networks had become formalized wisdom, taught to every armor officer. But the human story behind the doctrine remained largely forgotten. The crews who had survived by driving backwards, the commanders who had risked courts-martial by tolerating unauthorized tactics, the desperate calculations that had convinced experienced sergeants that retreat might be tactically sounder than advance. These details disappeared into after-action reports and training manuals that reduced human survival to abstract tactical principles. McBride's final reflection, recorded in an oral history interview conducted in 1978, captured the essential truth that statistics could not convey. We learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to die for doctrine that doesn't work. Those crews who backed up their Shermans when Panthers opened fire weren't running away from a fight. They were refusing to accept a fight they couldn't win, then finding ways to fight on their terms instead of the enemy's. That's not cowardice. That's tactical intelligence. The innovation that saved hundreds of American tank crews came not from advanced technology or superior resources, but from willingness to question fundamental assumptions about how armored warfare should be conducted. Sometimes the most profound military advances emerged from the simple recognition that doctrine written in peacetime classrooms might not apply to battlefields where the enemy refused to cooperate with your training manual. The reverse defensive maneuver proved that American strength lay not in rigid adherence to approved procedures, but in pragmatic flexibility that valued results over regulations. Tank crews who learned to survive by driving backwards had discovered a truth that formal military education struggled to teach, that sometimes moving away from threats at maximum speed was the fastest route to victory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.